Of all the systems that make up your house, there are some systems that you operate and use every single day. Think your plumbing, your HVAC, your electrical system when you turn on and off the lights, and or your doors and windows when you exit and enter your home. But there are other systems that you probably don't even think about, but that still have a huge impact on your quality of life and the longevity of your home. So in today's video, we're going to talk about insulation. Now, insulation is part 8 of my 9-part Home Systems Explained series. And today we're going to talk about everything there is to know about insulation, what insulation is, how it works, how much of it you need depending on what part of the country you live in, and where your insulation is located. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. So let's kick our discussion off by talking about why insulation even matters. And to put it very, very simply, your insulation is going to keep your hot areas hot and your cold areas cold. So this is going to be the system that maintains the climate in your house stable throughout the year. Now, the way insulation works is it prevents heat from transferring from one area to another. And it does that in a couple of different ways. The most common way that we insulate areas is by using some type of material that traps air in between two locations. Air, as it turns out, is a great insulator, both for heat and for electricity. Fun fact. So it's super easy to use air to maintain a thermal barrier to keep the hot areas hot and the cold areas cold. Insulation in your house works much the same way as putting on a coat. So what your coat does when you put it on is it creates a little air pocket between the coat and your body. So it allows your body to heat up that little pocket of air between you and the coat, which then creates this nice little cozy air bubble. So your insulation in your house does the exact same thing. It's just that typically we'll do it using some type of fibrous material like fiberglass or cellulose, and we do it behind the walls so that you don't have big poofy insulative material poking out of all your walls. So the next aspect of insulation that I'd like to talk about is how we measure how insulative a material is. And in the residential space, we use what's called an R value. So the R value is simply a number that ranges from R10 to R13 on the low end to R60, 70, 80, or 90 on the high end. And this R value just defines how well this particular material is going to prevent heat transfer. A piece of fiberglass insulation that has an R value of R13 is going to allow much more heat to transfer through that material than a piece of attic insulation that has an R value of R60. Now you may be thinking, how do I know what R value I need in what part of my house? And conveniently, the Department of Energy actually classifies different parts of the United States as different zones. Now, these climate zones range from zones 1 and 2, which are the hottest, to zones 7 and 8, which are the coolest. So zone 1 is going to be Guam, Hawaii, the very southern part of Texas, the very southern tip of Florida, and zones 7 and 8 are going to be the very northern parts of Maine, Minnesota, up in Alaska, areas like that. So here in Charleston, we're right on the border between zone 2 and 3, which means that we do have very hot summers, but we also have some temperate winters. But in any case, these different climate zones are going to dictate the level of insulation that we need to have in our attics, in our walls, and in our crawl spaces. So before we get too far into where you want to have insulation, which, spoiler alert, I just told you about, we're going to talk about what types of materials we use for insulation in residential homes. And these can be basically broken down into 4 different types. We have fiberglass, cellulose, spray foam, and then rigid foam board insulation. Fiberglass insulation is by far the most common, and it's what you'll see in most attics in most homes, or if you happen to accidentally knock a hole in your drywall, you might see some pink fluffy stuff behind the walls. So that is fiberglass insulation. Most of it is going to be that kind of pink fluffy material that you're going to find in your attic. And the benefits of fiberglass insulation are that it's fairly affordable, it's common, great for DIYers because you can buy it in bats. So that's BATTS, bats, which are basically just these big fluffy chunks of insulation that are pre-cut to be approximately the size of the trusses in your attic or the size of the gaps in between the studs in your walls. So very convenient. The second type of insulation that's pretty common nowadays is cellulose insulation. And this is typically blown into attic spaces. Now, cellulose is great because it's fire retardant, which is nice, and it is pest resistant, which is also nice. You don't have, little mice or rats that are making nests in your insulation in your attic. Big plus. But the downside of cellulose insulation, and really fiberglass insulation too, if it's blown in, is that it can settle over time, which then reduces the R value. So if that cellulose or your fiberglass settles, it compacts the layers of fiberglass or cellulose. And that means that there's less air that can be trapped in between those fibers, which means that it's going to be easier for heat to get through that thinner layer of trapped air in your insulation. Now, the next type of insulation is called spray foam. This stuff is pretty expensive. You'll see it in some luxury homes. Usually it's sprayed in the rafters or against the roof sheathing. And this stuff is great because it provides a huge swath of continuous coverage. It helps to seal small gaps in your drywall or in your attic. And it has the benefit of providing moisture control as well, because again, it seals those small gaps. Now, the last type of insulation that you'll find is called rigid foam board. This can be used in a couple different places. The most common place I've seen rigid foam board insulation used is around the exterior wall of a foundation or in a crawl space, or in smaller areas where it's difficult to get fiberglass insulation in that small area. So you can get little 2 foot by 2 foot sheets of rigid foam board insulation, and you can just cut those to size to fit wherever you want. So maybe on your attic access, you could cut a piece of foam board insulation, put it on top of your attic access, and that's going to help minimize your heat loss from your house into your attic. So now that we know in general what insulation is, how it works, how the R value is assigned to insulation, so how well insulation actually does its job, and what type of climate zone we're in, which here in Charleston is right on the line of zone 2. Now we're going to talk about where in your home you should have insulation. And if you don't have insulation in these areas, you definitely need to get some in. So the first location, this one should be pretty obvious, is your attic. Your attic is one of the most important places because, as it turns out, heat rises. So we want to have a nice insulating barrier between the living areas of your home and the attic. Now here in Charleston, we're in zone right along the border of zone 2 and 3. So the Department of Energy recommends having a minimum R value of R30 to R60 in your attic. This is really going to help prevent any heat from radiating from the attic down into the living spaces, and it's going to help keep your home much more comfortable and keep your energy bills lower. Now, again, the type of insulation that you're going to find in your attic is going to depend on the home builder or the previous homeowner or you yourself if you decide to put insulation in your attic. Typically what I've seen is blown in insulation. So it just kind of looks like that loose fill, almost like cotton candy, that pink stuff. Usually the pink stuff is fiberglass. Other insulating materials that you'll see are cellulose, like I mentioned earlier. And if you have some insulation that was replaced by someone who was not the original builder, you may see an insulation bat or a fiberglass insulation bat. And like I mentioned before, a bat of insulation can either come faced or unfaced, which means it has a vapor barrier on one side of it, but it's really just a long strip of insulation that's already cut to size and it already has a specified thickness to give you that proper R value for whatever space you're going to put it in. So after your attic, which is the most important place to have insulation, the second most important place to have insulation is in your walls. So when it comes to walls, it's extremely important to have insulation in your exterior walls, and it could be beneficial to have insulation in your interior walls as well. So for your exterior walls, again, right on line of zone 2 and 3, the Department of Energy recommends having a minimum of R13 insulation inside your exterior walls, which is perfectly fine for what we have here in Charleston. Although putting insulation in your walls that has a higher R value than R13 will only lower your energy bills further. Now, the way you can get insulation in your walls, again, a couple different ways. If you have the studs exposed, you can just put a bat of insulation right in between the studs. Some of them just use friction to stay in between the studs. And you can buy these in big rolls or in pre-stacked sheets. A couple different ways to buy them. One of the other ways you can do it is if you find that your house doesn't have any insulation in the exterior walls because of either a poor remodel or maybe it's a historic home that doesn't have any insulation in it, you can get spray foam insulation and make a small hole in the wall and then spray it into the gap between the studs and between the drywall and the exterior wall of your home. And it's going to fill that whole space with insulating material. Now, this is going to provide a lot more coverage, but it is going to be a little bit more expensive than just having the fiberglass insulation installed when the walls are open. While it is important to have insulation in your exterior walls because of the energy management part of it, it can also be helpful because having that insulating barrier in your exterior walls is going to help reduce noise from coming inside the house from the outside. So like I mentioned before, air is an excellent insulator, and it doesn't just insulate thermal energy, it also insulates electrical energy and sound. So one of the things you can find in more luxury homes, or if you're remodeling your own house and you want to put a little extra touch on it, you can put insulation in your interior walls. So that way, if you have a bedroom wall, for example, that shares a wall with the living room TV, if you have insulation in that interior wall between those two rooms, it's going to be much more quiet in the bedroom. So you won't be kept up with your kids or your family member or your guests watching TV all night long while you're trying to go to sleep. So the last place you should find insulation in your house, other than the attic and the walls, is your crawl space if you have one. Now, a lot of homes in Charleston, especially ones that are being built now that are not custom, that are just being built super quickly by these major national home builders, a lot of those don't have a crawl space foundation. They're just built on a slab. So if you have a slab foundation in your house, this next section doesn't apply to you because there's no point in putting more insulation underneath a slab. It doesn't really do you any good. However, if you own a home that has a crawl space, then you have air that's underneath the living area of your house, but above the ground that the foundation is built upon. So in this case, this is another location where you would want to have insulation between the exterior and the interior of your home. The DOE recommends that you have a minimum of R13 underneath your floors if you have a crawl space, although a little bit higher R value is going to give you a better thermal performance. Now, as for the type of insulation that you can put in your crawl space, the most common insulation that I see is fiberglass bats because they're nice and easy, pre-cut. They fit right between the joists or under your floorboards. But I've also seen rigid foam board used around in the exterior walls of the foundation, just because it provides a larger amount of coverage and you can cut it and shape it wherever you need to fit it to. Now, while we're on the topic of crawl spaces here in the humid Charleston heat, I must say that one of the biggest issues that I see with crawl spaces is not necessarily that they're under insulated. It's that there is a lot of moisture intrusion and wood rot and pest activity. So if you have it in your budget to encapsulate your crawl space, I would highly recommend doing this. It's going to cost a couple $1,000s if you get a reputable company to do it, but over the long term, it's going to save you foundation issues, sagging joists, insulation issues, heat transfer issues, and energy bill management. So definitely would recommend doing that if it's in your budget. So now that we've covered what insulation is, how it works, what the R values are, where you should find your insulation, we're going to talk about a little bonus section, which is sealing around your windows and doors. So while technically this is not an insulating material, it does help to maintain your energy bills nice and low because it prevents air from seeping into or out of your house. So some of the most common offenders of these air seepages are either around your exterior doors, around light fixtures, which is something that people don't think about. If when the light fixture is installed in your ceiling, the contractor cuts a hole in the drywall that's too big and then doesn't seal it, then that's a way for hot air that's in the attic to seep into the house and provide a nice source of energy loss. Now, the plus side is that fixing the weather stripping around your doors or sealing small gaps around your windows and doors is actually a super easy fix, and it's only going to cost you about 10 or 20 bucks if you go to the hardware store. You can buy weather stripping for a couple bucks. You can buy some caulk to seal around any gaps in the ceilings or your walls. And then you can also buy spray foam that expands to seal gaps as well. That's super helpful for sealing gaps that are in the exterior of the house and preventing any rodent activity from making their way into your walls. The bottom line with sealing air gaps is that if you combine excellent insulation and air sealing in your home, you're going to get maximum thermal efficiency and maximum energy savings on your bill. Now that we've talked about the different types, materials, and locations where you can find insulation in your home, let's do a quick segment on the costs of insulation replacement and problems that you should look out for. So let's start with problems you should look out for. This one should be pretty self-evident. If you have low insulation in your home, you're going to see higher energy bills. You're going to see draftiness in a room. You're going to have rooms that are either much hotter or much colder than other rooms in your house. These are all warning signs that you may have an under-insulated house. Also, if you go up in your attic and you just see that there's no insulation in the attic, that's also a pretty good indicator that you need some attic insulation in your house. Now, as far as cost and lifespan, insulation is one of those things that once it's in your walls, once it's in your attic, it's pretty much a set it and forget it type scenario. So good insulation is going to last anywhere from 20, 30, 40, 50 years plus. I've seen older homes that were built in the 60s and 70s that still have the original insulation in them, and the insulation is still working just fine. Now, that being said, the R value of the insulation is going to determine the price. So for example, I just put some new insulation in one of my flips, and I bought big bats of insulation of R60 for the attic, and it was about $100 for a package of 10 sheets that covered around 80 square feet. So I was able to re-insulate about half of the attic space for only about $300, but that's in materials, that's no labor. So if you want to find someone who's going to either do blown-in insulation, where they use a machine to spray the insulation all over the attic spaces. Or if you're going to use a more expensive method of insulation, such as spray foam, your costs are going to be a lot higher. So the materials alone, as far as fiberglass insulation goes, fairly inexpensive, maybe a couple $100 up to $1,000, depending on how much area you have to insulate. But the labor costs are where it's going to get you. So I would expect that if you're going to re-insulate your entire attic, this is probably going to cost you in the range of $3,000 to $5,000, depending on the size of your attic. While it does hurt to have to pay all this money up front, the money that you put down for good insulation is going to pay you dividends over the long term in your energy savings. So as a quick side note, let's say that your energy bill is $150 a month. Well, at a 6.5% interest rate, that $150 a month is equivalent to the payment on $25,000 of home purchase. So what this means is if you can save $150 a month in energy bills, that adds back in $25,000 of purchasing power that you have when you're first purchasing your home that will pay off in the long term. So just something to think about. So as far as insulation goes, that's pretty much all she wrote. In today's video, we talked about what insulation is, how it works, the R values, the different climate zones, where you find insulation, how you install it, and the general problems you could find and the costs of putting new insulation in your home. Now, if you want to see the other 8 parts of the home series that are in this playlist, please check out the other videos in this playlist. There's a deep dive on everything from foundations, framing, roofing, HVAC, plumbing, electrical, windows and doors, and now insulation. And if you're looking for the final part of my 9-part home series, you'll have to stick around for next week. But if you're looking just for a general overview, you can also find an overview that provides a general look at all these different systems in the description below, or just check out the playlist and you can find the video there.